Using your spotlight caches effectively is one of the hardest things in Marvel Snap. I am here to take a look at all the cards releasing in August so you can know which ones are the best to spend on. Let's get started. First up in the spotlight caches, and by the time this video releases, this spotlight cache will actually be out, is Marvel Boy, a 3/2 with the ability to give +1 power to up to 3 of your 1-cost cards when the turn ends. And this is a very powerful card just looking at the numbers. Basically, if you have 3 1-drops, by the time you play Marvel Boy, he's going to be a 3/14. There is one extremely obvious home for this card, and that is Zoo. I truly do not expect to see this card many other places, but perhaps I'm wrong. Zoo is where I'm going to focus my Marvel Boy efforts. As a 3/2 that works incredibly well with cards like Squirrel Girl, it does seem like a fairly obvious place for the card to end up being, and when you play it after a Squirrel Girl, 3/14 is great payoff. However, the issues Zoo has are not even necessarily related to Marvel Boy. The upside of Zoo is that because it's such a powerful deck with such cheap, powerful threats, it is able to generate a ton of points and still react and adapt to the metagame. It can run cards like Shadow King or Shang-Chi or Kyera to prevent your stuff from getting killmongered. That's good. That's a classic recipe for a good deck, is good points and good interaction at cheap rates. That's a lot of good decks in Marvel Snap's history, and Marvel Boy is an excellent source of points, freeing you up to enable your cheap interaction. In addition, Zoo's major issue is typically that it is relatively easy to beat. Or maybe not relatively easy, but relatively clear. Zoo is a deck that plays a lot of 1-drops. Killmonger is very good into 1-drops. Kyera is the one thing preventing you from that, so either you turn off the Kyera, or you simply allow metagame pressures to move them away from that. What do I mean by that? In the previous metagames where we've had a Zoo deck at the top of the meta, one of the major dynamics that I observed was that people were cutting Kyera in order to be better into the mirror. The more people are playing Zoo, the less profitable it is to be running a 3/4 that doesn't do anything in the Zoo mirror. You want to be able to actually adapt and react to that. A lot of my personal deck building strategies are taking a deck and then tuning it a little bit to beat the mirror, so I feel good into a wide variety of matchups. With Zoo, however, that's not as profitable, because as soon as you start thinking about cutting Kyera, you end up running into decks like Silver Surfer or Destroy that are leveraging Killmonger in a meaningful way against you. That's a really big problem. Zoo's upside, of course, is great points and great flexibility, but the downside is clearly attackable weaknesses. And for this reason, I think Marvel Boy will be a great stress test of just how good Zoo is allowed to be, because this is fundamentally a very strong card. But what will determine whether it is a flash in the pan or a long-term player in the metagame is how people react to it and what level of play Zoo gets to. How much better than everything else is Zoo actually going to be? Because if it's a lot better than everything else, suddenly there's a huge incentive to tech against this card and start being a Killmonger deck all the time. If it's not a lot better than everything else, if maybe, 7% of the metagame is on Zoo, suddenly we're not feeling that pressure to Killmonger everything, and that will actually probably allow Marvel Boy to succeed more. I've never seen a card that is so obviously clearly there on power that is more at the mercy of metagame dynamics than Marvel Boy. I think his power is so clear and so strong that it's really just a question of how the metagame adjusts to him as to whether or not he will remain as a major player or whether he will be relegated to a bit player in a bit deck as people play a bunch of Killmonger. I'm really interested to see how this ends up shaking out, and I think this is a great way for them to develop cards going forward, because as we saw from Gilgamesh, if you want to run a card in a deck that is as narrow as Zoo, as focused on a vulnerable population of 1-cost cards as Zoo, it actually does have to be meaningfully stronger than the other cards that you can run. Gilgamesh, for example, had to get a buff. It was already at like Ronin Devil Dinosaur level. It had to get a buff to 5/9, which made it be able to hit like 520, 521 in order to see reasonable play. It had to be better than its peers because it was limited to being in a Zoo deck. And I think Marvel Boy is sort of similar to that. It has to be better than other 3-drops if it wants to make Zoo a real thing. And it looks like it does want to make Zoo a real thing. So the next question is, once Zoo is a real thing, what happens from there? Alongside Marvel Boy in the caches is the newly nerfed Blob. Blob really only has one home right now, and that is Arishem. Thanos has not been a real thing. I realized looking at the conception of this cache that I kind of wonder if they thought Marvel Boy might be a Thanos card. I cannot see a lot of incentive for it being a Thanos card compared to it being a Zoo card, but this was a card that was previously run in Thanos when Thanos was a deck you could reasonably play, which it's been a while since then. Right now, the only reason you'd want to pick up Blob is because you are a huge fan of Arishem decks and you don't already have him. Blob is a phenomenal piece of Arishem decks, but since the nerf, I will say, a little bit more replaceable than it was previously. Previously, Blob was very much what Arishem decks were built around doing, and you can tell from the nerf that it was still one of the best cards in the deck, even after they removed the synergy with Mystique. It remains fairly strong as an Arishem card. I just don't know exactly how irreplaceable it is, and when you're contemplating spending a Spotlight cache, you need to be pretty sure the card is irreplaceable. The twice nerfed Red Hulk is still a strong, powerful, reasonable card, but I think reasonable is what I want to emphasize here. This has gone from being clearly the best 6-drop in the game to being one of a group of, say, 5 or 6 of them. I've seen this as the top end in various Sandman decks, and honestly, I do like those builds a little bit more. I have seen this as a card that people run in various Arishem decks when you're in need of a 6-drop. I think basically that this card is part of a group of extremely strong 6-drops, Ultron, Magneto, Doctor Doom, just to name a few, that you will pick and choose depending on the needs of the deck in question. The needs that this card fills are very clear, very straightforward. If you just want a big number in one lane, Red Hulk is probably the best 6-drop at getting you a big number in one lane. That is the role you are opening Spotlight caches for this card to fill. If you are opening for Red Hulk, that is because you want that specific thing. And winning one lane is genuinely a very good thing. You just got to make sure you also win another one. Red Hulk is the best in the game at that role, at being the biggest 6-drop around. That's what he does, then he does it well. If you want that in your deck, Red Hulk is a reasonable option. Wiccan is a 4/7, good stats, with an ability that says, on reveal, if you have spent all your energy this game, +2 energy. Now, +2 energy is a powerful, powerful ability. I'm not going to scoff at that in any way. 4/7 is reasonable stats. Here's the thing. I think Wiccan wants to be a Quicksilver Domino 3-drop card, and I'm not sure that's what he's actually going to be. I think in realistic worlds where people play Wiccan, you end up doing something like Quicksilver, Psylocke, or Zabu, Wiccan on 3. And that all sounds really good and really cool, and I'm with you, that's dope, right? Wiccan on 3 means that on turn 5, on turn 4, on turn 6, you have all this extra energy. That's awesome. That's super cool. You have extra energy over your opponent. You have an additional 6 energy over the course of the game. Wait a minute. Arishem already gives you that. That's my fundamental issue with Wiccan. I like what Wiccan is doing. I think it is cool. I think it is unique. Fundamentally, even if you cheat this card out, you are getting +6 energy more than your opponent. Arishem is giving you that, and it's giving you that earlier. And it's also giving you that without having to cheat the card out. Like, it's also giving that without the additional conditions. To me, Arishem's downside is so much more minimal than any card that actually involves having to play a card in order to get an effect. Like, yes, it is bad that you are starting with extra cards in your deck with Arishem. I get that, but I think when you compare him to every other ramp effect in the game, you start looking at the other ramp effects and saying, why would I ever play something that I have to draw and play to get this effect? My deck is predicated on drawing and playing this card to get something that I can get from another card without having to draw and play anything. And I think that is the meaningful issue with Wiccan, if there is one. I actually kind of like this card. I would like there to be a Quicksilver Domino deck. I don't think this card can do it, and I don't know what it would have to say on it to make that real. Maybe it would have to say +3. Like, maybe this card would have to say, you get +3 energy. Just do something really dumb with it, right? But as is, I just don't think the squeeze is worth the juice, or the juice is worth the squeeze when it comes to Wiccan. And I know for some people, the action is the juice, right? Like some people just want to set things up and do something cool. And to those people, I say, I think you can probably try to pick up Wiccan. What I keep coming to when I talk about Wiccan, though, is I don't know what you're supposed to do after him. Like, there's this sort of sliding scale of how much an energy is worth at a different point in time. We know that it's really good to have one extra energy on every one of the early turns of the game because that allows you to play above curve and not play the worst cards in the game, one-cost cards. But it's not necessarily as good to have 2 extra energy on turn 6. What does that actually mean? What does having 2 extra energy on turn 6 unlock in practical terms? You play a Jeff alongside your Doctor Doom. Is that worth doing all of this for? Like, that's the real thing that, like, there's like this sort of sliding scale at which extra energy is either this game-breaking thing or just not worth doing. And the earlier you get that extra energy, the way better off it is. And Wiccan just seems to come down a little bit too late for me to feel good about it. When you think about what the old power plays in these sort of Arishem decks where you had the turn 3 Loki, now we have the turn 2 Loki, you had the turn 4 Doc Ock, the turn 4 Leech, all that stuff, right? And it's like, this is coming down on turn 4 unless you cheat it out. And that's sort of the fundamental issue. There's like a sort of degree of, this comes out on turn 4, your turn 5 is a 6-drop, your turn 6 is a 6-drop and a 1-drop, or a 6-drop and a 2-drop. And it's like, was that worth doing any of this? I don't know. Alongside Wiccan in the cache is Loki, and Loki is a card that I have been a huge fan of for an extremely long time. This current iteration of the card, though, it does seem like it might only be an Arishem card, and that is a little bit sad for me personally, as I've enjoyed playing this card in mid-range shells. Loki is a card that goes in decks that are piles of no synergy, right? I don't think there's a reasonable case for it to go in Thena decks until you are trying to specifically beat other Thena decks in mirrors. It's very good at that. But our metagame is too diverse for that to actually be something that I want to do right now. So what I want to play Loki in is just a pile of cards with like general synergy and see what happens from there. And it's like, oh, okay, is that actually worth doing? Like if I just put all the good cards in a deck, isn't that just Arishem with extra steps? Wouldn't I just rather be playing Arishem, which is doing that, but also ramping? And that's sort of where I arrive at with Loki. I'm not sure this card has a home on its own anymore. I think this is a card that is an Arishem snap condition more than it is anything else. And that personally makes me a little bit sad, but I'd imagine there are probably far more people who are very glad at no longer having to meaningfully deal with the fact that their opponent is playing their deck better than they are. Loki, I want to try to make work. I have not been able to successfully make work outside of Arishem. That is where I'm at on this card right now. This is honestly such a fascinating cache because between Wiccan, Loki, and Pixie, there are 3 like cards in this cache that are like, oh, I'm going to teach you a different way to play this game. I'm going to teach you how to live differently. And Pixie is definitely one of those cards. Pixie's a card where it's really, I wish this card could be just a little bit stronger because I really enjoy playing Pixie decks. And I think that of the cards in here, it's the one that has the most like self-contained power. But right now, there's not a lot of reason to be a Pixie deck. A lot of Pixie deck building is similar to the type of new speculative Loki deck building that I described, which is like a collection of good cards that don't have a lot of synergy, which ends up falling short in the face of collections of good cards that do have synergy, i.e. Thena decks. And so Pixie decks, like being forced to play a 2-1 and a 3-3 to get a potential payoff is usually just going to be worse than being able to play, I don't know, all your cards are 3-5s, you also have a 2-10 or whatever, right? Like that's your Thena deck, right? It ends up being just like, you end up being just a little bit disadvantaged in all of those sort of mid-range pseudo-mirrors, and that is an issue that I don't think has been reasonably solved. To me, Pixie sort of goes into the metagame when Mobius ends up being relevant. Did you know his middle name was Mobius? That's the joke, right? Mobius and Mobius, it's a Mobius strip. Okay. Anyway, when Pixie is good is when Mobius is good. A lot of the times that I want to play a Mobius deck, I want to lean into being a Mobius deck, and that means Pixie because you have this synergistic combo type thing that goes with it. Mobius is not a particularly major part of this metagame. In metagames where he ends up being a part of it, I think it could be worth having Pixie, but right now when I look at this cache, I see 3 potential enablers that want to teach you how to live that might not be able to keep up with what's actually going on right now. Speed might be the most underrated card of the season, and I don't really think that's a super hot take because Nobody seems to think this card is any good at all. So being the most underrated card, it only means he has to be a little bit better than that, right? When I look at speed, I see a card that is a 3/9 if you curve out in a season where they just released a season pass card in Kate Bishop that helps you curve out and never skip energy. In a world where, in theory, Wiccan also exists and you can maybe curve into that, but I'm not sure how you finish that out, The thing that really strikes me about speed specifically is that this card is just a really big number. And when we look at the 3-drop slot, there are some of those cards, but what is the number that this card needs to be meaningfully better than Nocturne? What is the number that this card needs to be meaningfully better than, I don't know, Copycat, right? And I think, 3/9 might be that number. Like, if this card is just a straight up 3/8 or 3/9 most of the time, that's really strong. That is actually just a really strong thing to do. I would like to know how often this ends up happening. This is the kind of card that we're kind of going to have to get our hands on and really play with, but I do think there's a reasonable chance that this card's like 3/7, 3/8 in most games you play it, and that is just a strong thing to be. I don't know if that's the exact space it needs to be in. Like, if this were a 3/4, I feel like I'd be worried that it's a little bit broken, but the fact is that this card is the kind of like quiet, powerful card that could end up being a surprise hit this season. I'm not particularly sure it will be, but I am seeing a lot of people who are way more down on what is a 3/8 or 3/9 than they probably should be. Iron Lad has had an interesting trajectory as a card. When it first released, it was the sort of almost archetype-defining good cards card, where you just played it in a deck that had a bunch of good hits, and then when it hit them, it was a great card, and it was just very far above rate. And it has gone pretty far from that. I think Iron Lad and Nico Minoru are two great examples that if people wanted to talk about power creep, they could really point to. Iron Lad was a card that was in basically every deck right up until it wasn't. Now, Iron Lad is a much more specifically used piece of technology, which is to say, this is mostly a Patriot card now. In much the same way that Nico Minoru is mostly a bounce and destroy card, Iron Lad has had his generalist spot sort of hewed away by other cards that are not necessarily all stronger, but maybe a little bit better at filling that role, right? There's a lot of 3/5s in the game now, and when there's a lot of 3/5s, it's hard to justify playing a 4/6 when those 3/5s also have upside. Cards like Copycat, cards like Nocturne, I think have really sort of cut into the playability of a card like Iron Lad, because they're not really all that much worse in terms of power, and they are notably cheaper. And I think that is where I'm at with Iron Lad right now. This is a card that I think a lot of people who were stuck in a year ago are going to look at you and they're going to say, this is a staple card. You can play him in so many decks. Oh my God. Realistically, Iron Lad goes in Patriot decks and sometimes Phoenix Force decks and sometimes Nomura decks. Those are kind of what he's actually in right now. And I think it's worth looking at the context. I could be wrong. Maybe in the future, when this cache comes out in a few weeks, there'll be like an Iron Lad renaissance or whatever, right? But I don't think that's particularly likely, and I do think that it would require some specific things to actually make happen. Don't get me wrong, Iron Lad is good. You still think, like, you're not wrong for thinking this card is a good card. But there's a difference between good card and worth spending a bunch of tokens or caches on. And I think that Iron Lad is, like, he's not a card you're going to be unhappy to have, but he's not moving the needle the way he was a year ago. Jeff, on the other hand, I honestly think is moving the needle the way he was a year ago. Like, it's interesting when you look at these two cards, came out fairly close to each other, had similar roles. One of them has really held up, one of them really has not. Jeff has held up tremendously. I think the only worry I would have for Jeff is what if Kate Bishop is so good she supplants Jeff as the go-to 2-drop? And I don't know if that's possible. It might be possible. I think it's possible, but I don't know. And Jeff's general power, like, I think we need to talk about how strong internal move is in some terms that we haven't really explored before. Let's talk about leverage. And when I talk about leverage in Marvel Snap, what I mean is a high leverage situation. A situation that, if it goes in your favor, will determine the outcome of the game. This can be a lot of different things, but the basic example I'd like to give is a situation where both players are investing points on the same location. If both of you are like playing your Shocker, Cyclops, Thing, and Hulk on the same location, whoever wins that location is probably going to be the person who's won the game because they've invalidated that 4-card investment from their opponent. Jeff is phenomenal in situations like that. If that Shocker is a Jeff instead, you can move that Jeff out and maybe target a different lane. In a situation where both players are playing 3 cards in that lane, Jeff can actually move into that lane and make a big difference. Basically, there are situations wherein your early positioning can really come back to bite you at the late end of the game. However, cards like Jeff, cards like Nocturne, do not have that issue. They fundamentally break that rule. They are almost impossible to have invalidated before the final turn of the game. They are always contributing something relevant on turn 6. And that alone is very powerful, but the fact that Jeff can also just be played through everything, like Sandman, whatever, it doesn't really matter. Jeff can be played into Professor X lanes, he can go everywhere. He's just a little bit amazing. And I think that is really what I think people should be thinking about more with why Jeff is strong. A lot of it is about always being in the right place at the right time is a superpower. And the better you are, the better you'll be able at using Jeff like this. And the worse you are, the more mistakes he's just going to cover up by existing in terms of placement of your early cards. Powerful card. Emperor Hulkling, to me, looks like a card that will either be the best 6-drop or like kind of an okay one, and I can't really figure out which it's gonna be. This is a 6/11, which is smaller than Magneto. There are not a lot of really amazing hits. The ones that really immediately come to mind are cards like Ultron, Arnim Zola, Leader. Those are really good hits. Maybe like Sasquatch is pretty good. Mockingbird might be okay depending on what you're doing. And there's a lot of hits that are just like, oh, it's the 6-drop that I wouldn't really run, but like maybe a little bit worse. Stuff like Scar. This is just actually Scar if it copies Scar. Magneto, it's just going to be a little bit worse Magneto. Things like that. And then there's stuff where it's like, oh, this is totally useless. The Infinite, Giganto, Agatha Harkness, stuff like that. It's hard for me to gauge this card. One thing that really gives me pause before I say it's terrible, though, is this is a card your opponent will never be able to play around. They simply will not know what this card is, and that can be very powerful in terms of cube equity. We've seen this with Arishem. We've seen how many players complain about, oh, I played around all this stuff, but they randomly generated the thing that beat me. This card is going to do that to people. This card is a card that it's going to have one of those win rates where it's like the played win rate's going to be insane because people are only going to play it when it's doing something completely messed up because it's like, oh, okay, I don't know, whatever the perfect 6-drop for the situation is that you can't possibly know about. I snapped you, you lost 8 because you snapped me back because you were like, there's nothing that could possibly beat me, and then forgot to play around 11 power Leader or 11 power Arnim Zola, right? That stuff is where I think this card's actual value may lie. We'll have to see how valuable that is. I think this card, honestly, though, is like 2 points of power from being super busted. If there was like a 13 on this card, I'm pretty sure it would just be the best 6-drop. At 11, we'll have to see how valuable that sort of unknown information leveraging is. We've seen it be valuable with Arishem. We've seen it be valuable with Copycat. This is a less powerful version of that is leveraging the same dynamic. So the question is, how much of those cards being powerful is their power? How much of it is this dynamic? And I think Hulkling is a great test of how valuable that hidden information is actually going to be and what costs you're going to want to pay for it. I expect to learn a ton from the release of Hulkling. Nimrod is a fairly solid, if well-defined card. This is a card that very specifically goes in Shuri, Nimrod, backup plans in Phoenix Force decks, in some of the weirder Galactus decks, and generally is not seen very much without Shuri. The one thing I want to highlight about Nimrod, though, is there is a data mined card called Symbiote Spider-Man in the upcoming season after this one. And that card is a really unique card that has an activate ability that merges it with the cheapest thing at the or the least powerful thing at the location. So if you play Symbiote Spider-Man on turn 4, and then you play Nimrod on turn 5, and then you merge Symbiote Spider-Man into Nimrod, you have a 12 power Nimrod just like you would if you Shuried it. I don't know if having effectively 2 Shuris is enough to make Shuri Nimrod stuff really popular and really powerful. I think there's also a bunch of like other weird, insane stuff you can do with Symbiote Spider-Man, but it does seem like a card that could be a Phoenix Force card, because it's not just that in Phoenix Force, it's like you have multiple man that you merge your Symbiote Spider-Man onto, and suddenly you're kicking 9 power, multiple men around the board, just like you would be with your Phoenix Force or whatever, but there's no internal move, but it's also possible. You have you could even merge it with your Phoenix Force and make that multiple man even bigger. Like, there's some stuff there that makes me wonder if Symbiote Spider-Man isn't a Phoenix Force Nimrod type card, and so that is one thing to consider when you're looking at this cache. Cannonball has fallen far from where he was when Professor X was his perfect lockdown partner. I do not see a ton of homes for Cannonball, but he does still have the role of Clog finisher, and I think that's honestly a good role for him to have, because his previous role of the most busted card of all time is probably not a good role to have long term. Now, Cannonball is not, in my opinion, a reason to open Spotlight caches. I personally think that right now he's not a draw in and of himself, but there are going to be certain types of players who want to do certain types of things that are going to want to have this card in their collection, and I have the utmost respect for those players. I don't think Cannonball is a bad card, but when we talk about cards in this channel, we tend to talk about them in the context of meta relevancy. Cannonball is a finisher card for a deck like Clog. You will be playing him in Clog decks. You will likely not be playing him anywhere else. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for making it through that video. I, as always, have been KM Best. You, as always, have been phenomenal. Remember to like and subscribe. I really appreciate it. And let me know in the comments which of these caches you plan on focusing on and why. I'm interested to see what the community thinks about these cards, about the cards in the caches alongside these new cards. Thank you so much for watching. Remember, I still read every comment, and I will see you in the next one.